I ran for politics against Chrystia Freeland. And as my daughter never ceases to remind me, I lost. But you know, people used to say that there were similarities between me and Chrystia, and that we both wrote books about the super rich. But you know, those books were very different. Chrystia's book was kind of all about how the rich are doing such a great job running the world, whereas my book was more in the spirit of the protesters who marched defiantly down Wall Street right after the 2008 crash, holding placards that read, "Jump, you fuckers!" My book was more in the jump you fuckers genre of books about the super rich. You know, I'm so glad to be back here at OPSEU. I always love talking to OPSEU. You know, this is such a great union, so huge and diverse. You are the backbone of our public services. And yet you get far too little credit for keeping our hospitals and our colleges and everything else running the way you do, even as Doug Ford is busy underfunding them. And you stood up to him against Bill 124, and I want to just point out how much I respect you for that. And you showed that collectively, when we stand together, we can take on bad guys and win. Now, I want to talk today about what an important moment this is for workers. You know, it's a moment of great difficulty, but also, I would say, a moment of great promise. I believe in many ways that there's a bigger prospect of meaningful, progressive social change now than really I've ever seen in my lifetime. You know, for decades now, business and right-wing governments have imposed on us, you know, what we often refer to as the neoliberal agenda, or you can just call it the business agenda. You know, we all know it: tax cuts for the rich, social spending cuts, privatization, attacks on labor unions. And of course, we were told that this agenda would create great wealth and it would trickle down. Well, it turns out it did create great wealth, but almost none of it trickled down. In fact, after 4 decades, the rich are now richer than they've ever been in history. The gap between the rich and the poor is the biggest it's ever been. And that's true in Canada as well as in the United States. And I would point out that this is, in fact, in many ways, the most significant social change of our era. And yet it's largely hidden. You know, the rich-poor gap, you never hear that talked about in the media, even though the impact on our lives is huge, absolutely enormous. And that's because the flip side of all that money going to the top is workers left struggling below. You know, we hear so much these days about the affordability crisis. And when you think about it, what is the affordability crisis? It's just another way of saying ordinary people don't have enough money. They don't have enough money to get by. You know, and the right wants us to blame immigrants for that, but it's not immigrants that have made off with the money, it's billionaires making off with the money. And it's also meant, all this money going to the top has also meant the impoverishment of our social programs, our wonderful healthcare and education systems, because the super rich, they don't care about those programs. They want to privatize them. They see them as nothing more than money-making opportunities. But for the rest of us, they're so basic to our lives. They're a lifeline to our well-being. And of course, Doug Ford has long been, keenly implementing this business agenda. So there's always lots of money, for health and beauty spas for the rich. But there's never enough for healthcare and education. I mean, post-secondary education, we see how clearly starved for funds it is. Ontario is near the bottom of the per-student funding among provinces. And we've seen all kinds of elimination of courses at colleges. And now just this week, we see the merging of Fleming and St. Lawrence College. We don't know where that's going to take us. And of course, Ford has recently announced cuts to the student loan program, make it a lot harder for poor kids to afford to go to college or university. Clearly, we need lots more money in post-secondary education. Okay, but where are we going to find that money? Everybody's paying lots of taxes already, right? Well, actually, no, not everybody. I mean, it's true, most Canadians pay a big chunk of their incomes in taxes. I'm sure you do. But there are a small number of ultra-wealthy Canadians, this is true, who pay almost no tax. And that's because the income tax system taxes us on the basis of our incomes, but they can avoid it because they get all the money they want by borrowing, using their wealth as collateral. So many of them end up paying virtually no tax. And that's why we need a wealth tax. Because quite seriously, otherwise the ultra-rich go virtually tax-free. And so the wealth tax, don't even think of it as a punishment. It's just a way to ensure that everybody contributes. So here's the proposal. And this is laid out in my new book that JP mentioned, Canceling Billionaires Before They Cancel Us. Oh, and it's written with tax expert Neil Brooks, who's at the back of the room there with a pile of books that we're happy to sign at the end if anybody wants. But our argument is Canada should have a wealth tax, and it would apply only to the ultra-rich. What do I mean by that? It means it wouldn't apply to anybody except people who, get this, have a fortune of $25 million. Now, that's a lot of money, okay? Well, let me just, how many here have $25 million? Come on, hands up, don't be shy. Well, I can't quite see the whole room. I'm guessing maybe half of you, something like that. No, the truth is, obviously, nobody in this room has $25 million, so you wouldn't be at all affected by a wealth tax. It would only, in fact, hit people, get this, in the top 0.1%. Now, that's not the top 1% that we always hear about. That is the top 1/10 of the top 1%. And by the way, they'd only pay a wealth tax of 1% a year, and only on the amounts above 25 million. So let's say you had a total wealth of 25 million and $100. You'd only pay the 1% on the $100, like $1 a year. But here's the point. There is so much wealth at the top that even a very modest wealth tax like this, that would rise to about 8% by the time you're a billionaire, but even this very modest tax would be able to collect $40 billion a year in this country. That's incredible. $40 billion would pay for so many things to improve our social programs, public transit, transitioning to renewable energy. For example, we could take $10 billion out of that $40 billion and make all colleges and university free for every student in the country. I mean, that would give working class kids a real chance to lift themselves out of poverty. I think it would transform this country, making it much more egalitarian, much fairer. And if that sounds too good to be true, that's because we're brainwashed to believe it's too good to be true. It's absolutely doable. You know, the Bay Street commentators always tell us, oh, you can't tax the rich, you can't tax the rich, because then they'll leave and they'll take all their assets with them. And that's the threat that's always used, and it certainly sounds believable and it sounds worrisome. But hold on a minute, not so fast. What they never tell us is that, yes, the rich can leave, but if they do, they'll face a hefty exit tax because all their unrealized capital gains would be subject to taxation when they exit the country, making their departure actually very expensive for them. In other words, all those threats about leaving are largely hollow. They don't want to pay a big exit tax, so they're not going to leave. But this is very important because it tells us we're much more powerful than we realize. We can impose a wealth tax on the rich, and the rich will just have to pay it, just like the rest of us have to pay the income tax. It's not optional. Collectively, we have a lot of power. We just have to start wielding that power. And by the way, you know, of course, it's hard to imagine, I guess, wielding that amount of power. After all, the rich are more powerful than they've ever been, richer and more powerful than they've ever been. But in many ways, that's why change is actually possible, because the wealth accumulation at the top today has become so extreme that the billionaires said, and Trump helping them out, have so overplayed their hand that a backlash is coming. In fact, you can already see it. We see the election of that wonderful New York City mayor, Mamdani, on a platform of taxing the rich. Everybody said he could never get elected. There he is, the mayor. Polls now show in the US 67% of Americans, including Republicans, support a wealth tax. In California, the healthcare workers union there is organizing to get a wealth tax on the ballot in next November's midterms. And the wealth tax is almost certainly going to be on the Democratic agenda in the next presidential election. And I would point out, similarly in Canada, do you realize polls show that fully 90% of Canadians support the idea of a wealth tax, despite the fact that the media never even mentions it? And you can be sure, if the issue gains momentum in the US, you know, the pressure will build in Canada as well. Furthermore, I would point out that the NDP has just chosen a highly articulate leader in Avi Lewis, big supporter of a wealth tax. And he's a big supporter of strengthening and expanding all our public programs. And you can see the mainstream commentators are out there attacking him, and that suggests he's really striking a nerve. He's on to something. Now, I want to come back to what we could do with all the revenue from a wealth tax. And of course, one thing we must do is strengthen our public health care system. I mean, Ford is always underfunding, and Ontario has the lowest per capita funding for health care of any of the provinces. We see Ottawa's largest hospital just this week announced it was going to have to lay off 400 workers. And of course, critics are always keen to criticize our healthcare system, saying it's not working. We have to try something new. And their idea of trying something new is always trying more privatization. But private healthcare is a terrible option. Because of course, as we know, it just means the rich buy their way to the front of the line. And the rich love that. They want a system, where they get to enter by the front door and everyone else is relegated to coming in the back door. But for the rest of us, public health care is essential because it means everybody gets medical care, no matter how rich or poor. The first person in line is the sickest, not the person with the biggest wallet. And let's not forget, we had to fight so hard to get that level of equality in our healthcare system. Back in the 1960s, when Medicare was first introduced in Saskatchewan, the doctors bitterly opposed it, and so there was a fierce battle. But the people won, and we got health care and the public health care. But the rich have been fighting ever since then to re-privatize public health care. And of course, they argue our public health care system doesn't work. I mean, they like to point out things like, a dog can get a hip replacement in Canada faster than a person. And you know what? That's true. That's true because veterinary medicine is a private marketplace. And with enough money, you can buy your way to the front of the line. With enough money, your dog can get a hip replacement the same day. With enough money, you can buy your dog a facelift or breast implants. But the flip side of that is that if you don't have enough money, the dog is put down. And that's the difference between a private marketplace and a public system. And that's why the public domain is so important. Business and the right, they're always wanting us to rely on the private marketplace, right? They want us to believe that humans are, by nature, purely self-interested. Therefore, they say society should be organized around private property, the marketplace, everybody looking out for themselves. And of course, it's true that humans are self-interested, but that's not the whole story. In fact, anthropologists, psychologists, philosophers, all the way back to Aristotle, insist that above all, humans are social animals. We're hardwired to work together, to collaborate, to cooperate. So yes, we fight and we compete, but mostly we get along, we cooperate. We devise collective solutions to benefit all of us. In fact, interestingly, that was the view of Charles Darwin, the great evolutionary biologist. Now, he's best known for his theory, survival of the fittest, which fits today's business narrative. Everybody's out for themselves, you're on your own, the strongest wins. But that business narrative is actually a distortion of Darwin's overall view of human nature and what he believed led to the successful evolution of the human species. Yes, he said, yes, humans compete, but Darwin insisted that crucial to human development was the human capacity for loving and caring for each other, for working together, for helping each other. And this is the very antithesis, of course, of the purely individualist values so celebrated in our business culture. Essentially, as Darwin observed, the key to our success as a species isn't just competing, but also, more importantly, cooperating. And I'd argue that we can see this cooperation in its highest form in our universal social programs, notably healthcare and education, which are built on principles of equality and inclusiveness, which, when you think about it, really is all about loving and caring for each other. So we've created these systems that ensure that all of us get to live educated, healthy lives, that we all have a chance, in other words, to develop to our fullest human potential. This is the triumph of the public domain, of public cooperation. And we can see this triumph today if we look at the Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark. Those countries are oh, geez. Oh, okay. Well, okay, yeah, okay. Those countries are rich like Canada, but unlike Canada, they also invest heavily in social programs, and therefore they're strong welfare states with a very high level of human development, and that makes them not just rich, but happy. That shows up in the annual happiness rankings of countries around the world, where all the Nordic countries, all 5 of them, are always in the top 10, and Finland, for the past 9 years, has been #1. Meanwhile, here in Canada, we're going in the opposite direction, cutting our social programs, and that explains why we've slipped in the happiness rankings from 5th place a decade ago to 25th place today. And of course, I'd argue this is weakening us as a country. Mark Carney talks about nation building, making us proud to be Canadians, but he's going about it the wrong way. He's cutting our social programs so he can invest in pipelines. How many Canadians, if you ask them what makes you proud to be Canadian, do they say pipelines? No, they say public health care. So it's disheartening. It's disheartening that our business and political leaders are so keen to dismantle our social programs and replace them with a marketplace. But this highlights the vital role of labor. Right-wingers are always attacking organized labor, referring to unions as special interests. And accuse unions of being greedy, only caring about their members, which is not true at all. Yes, unions do defend the interests of their members, but they're not just about protecting themselves and their members. They're also about championing universal social programs that everyone benefits from. Unions played an absolutely key role in the great battle to bring about Medicare in this country. And they've been on the forefront of every battle to expand and enrich our social program. Labor plays a unique role in championing the broader public interest. This was captured so nicely, in a wonderful quote by J.S. Wordsworth, an early labor leader in Canada. He was explaining why the labor movement supports universal public programs, and he put it this way, he said, "What we desire for ourselves, we wish for all." I love that phrase. What we desire for ourselves, we wish for all. And that's why unions champion universal social programs that create equality, inclusiveness, and benefits for all. And that is the very opposite of being a special interest. If you want to see what a special interest is, look no further than Doug Ford and his corporate buddies. They only fight for things for themselves. They never say what we desire for ourselves, we wish for all, because they don't care about all. They're essentially saying what we desire for ourselves, we wish for ourselves, and the rest of you can go to hell. And that's why labor is so important. We need organized labor, fighting for our treasured public programs, for the public domain that benefits all of us. And I'd argue that's why the wealth tax is a key vehicle for that, because it provides the funds we need for those programs, and it enables us to flex our collective muscle. And that's why we need a wealth tax and why we need organized labor leading the fight for it. Okay, so let me end with some good news. Ordinary people are on our side. The polls show very clearly people care about social programs, not tax cuts. Sure, if you ask people, do you want a tax cut? Do you want some chocolate? Do you want some ice cream? They say yes. But if you ask them to choose, do you want a tax cut or do you want stronger social programs, overwhelmingly, they choose the social programs. Now, that's not what you'd get from reading the media. The media is always implying we're all so angry about taxes, that we're suffering from tax rage. That is not true. In fact, I'm going to tell you right now, there's only a very small group out there suffering from tax rage, and I'm going to identify that group. It's rich, older men. And I'll just explain quickly how I know that. There's a little publication called The Wealthy Boomer that comes out from time to time in the National Post. It's a very odd publication, consists really of just two things: articles about tax rage and ads for Viagra. And that makes me wonder, does tax rage cause erectile dysfunction? Or is it the other way around? Does erectile dysfunction cause tax rage? The point is, the right is impotent. Actually, no. To be truthful, the right isn't impotent. The point is, neither are we. In fact, we are together, we are so strong, and we are more potent than the right and the billionaires who dominate our politics. But it's time we use that power. It's time that we demand this be a country that protects and celebrates the public domain. It's time that we demand that this be a country where everyone enters by the front door. Thank you.